Today's briefing focuses on what multiple intelligence sources describe as the most critical geopolitical confrontation of 2026. Leaked revelations surrounding President Trump's Iran strike plans and the extraordinary diplomatic pressure campaign mounted by Russia and China to prevent American military action. According to classified assessments that have reached this analysis, President Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin conducted emergency communications with the White House explicitly urging restraint on Iran, only to have their appeals categorically rejected by President Trump. This is not routine diplomatic disagreement. This is not standard great power competition. This represents a fundamental realignment of global power dynamics, where the United States is operating entirely independent of traditional constraint mechanisms, and where America's primary geopolitical rivals are discovering their inability to influence Washington's decision-making on matters of existential importance to their strategic interests. The significance of this development cannot be overstated. When the leaders of the world's second and third most powerful militaries make direct appeals to prevent a war, and those appeals are dismissed, it signals that the international system has entered uncharted territory. The leaked intelligence regarding Trump's Iran strike plans reveals detailed operational frameworks, including target lists, force deployments, and timeline projections that suggest advanced planning far beyond contingency preparation. The fact that Xi and Putin possess sufficient intelligence about these plans to mount coordinated intervention attempts indicates either serious security compromises within the American military apparatus or deliberate signaling from the Trump administration that the strikes are imminent, regardless of international opposition. Either scenario carries profound implications for global stability. This briefing will examine several critical dimensions of this crisis. First, the specific nature of the leaked strike plans and what they reveal about American military intentions toward Iran. Second, the unprecedented diplomatic intervention by China and Russia and what it tells us about their calculations regarding regional stability. Third, Trump's decision to reject these appeals and the domestic and international factors driving that choice. Fourth, the strategic positioning of all parties as the conflict trajectory appears to accelerate. And finally, what this confrontation reveals about the evolving nature of great power relations in an era where traditional diplomatic mechanisms are proving increasingly ineffective. According to intelligence assessments that have been corroborated through multiple channels, the leaked Iran strike plans represent comprehensive military operations extending far beyond limited punitive actions. The operational frameworks reportedly include three distinct phases: initial suppression of Iranian air defenses and command and control infrastructure, followed by systematic destruction of nuclear-related facilities and ballistic missile production sites, concluding with strikes on Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps installations and logistics networks supporting regional proxy forces. The timeline projections suggest operations extending between 12 and 18 days, significantly longer than the June 2025 conflict that lasted only 12 days before diplomatic intervention secured a ceasefire. The target lists circulating within intelligence communities indicate over 400 strike objectives distributed across Iranian territory, with particular emphasis on deeply buried facilities that survived the June 2025 operations. Satellite imagery analysis conducted by independent observers has identified ongoing American efforts to position bunker-penetrating munitions at forward operating bases, suggesting preparations to engage hardened underground sites using GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator weapons that were not employed during previous engagements. The presence of B-2 Spirit stealth bombers at Diego Garcia, confirmed through multiple open-source intelligence platforms, indicates readiness to conduct long-range strike missions that would be difficult for Iranian air defenses to intercept. Intelligence reporting also suggests that the leaked plans include provisions for extended maritime operations designed to close the Strait of Hormuz to Iranian military and commercial traffic, effectively imposing a naval blockade that would strangle Tehran's petroleum export capacity. The deployment of additional carrier strike groups to the Persian Gulf region, combined with forward positioning of mine countermeasure vessels, indicates American intention to maintain long-term control over critical shipping lanes, regardless of Iranian attempts at denial. This component of the operational plan represents significant escalation beyond previous engagements, as it would directly impact global energy markets and invite Iranian asymmetric responses against commercial shipping throughout the region. The sophistication and comprehensiveness of these plans suggest months of detailed preparation involving extensive intelligence collection, force positioning, and diplomatic coordination with regional partners. The fact that such detailed planning has leaked to foreign intelligence services raises critical questions about operational security and whether certain elements within the American national security apparatus oppose the planned operations and deliberately shared information to complicate execution. Alternatively, the leaks may represent intentional signaling designed to demonstrate American resolve and force Iranian concessions through coercive diplomacy backed by credible military threats. Intelligence assessments indicate that Chinese President Xi Jinping initiated direct communication with President Trump on February 5, 2026, during what was publicly characterized as a routine diplomatic call addressing trade and regional issues. However, classified reporting suggests that the primary purpose of Xi's outreach was to convey Chinese concerns about American military plans against Iran and to explicitly request restraint. According to sources familiar with the exchange, Xi emphasized China's substantial economic interests in Iranian petroleum and warned that American military action would destabilize regional energy markets at a time when the global economy remains fragile. The Chinese leader reportedly offered expanded purchases of American agricultural products and concessions on critical mineral exports in exchange for postponement of military operations, proposing a framework where Beijing would use its leverage with Tehran to secure Iranian compliance with American demands through diplomatic channels. Russian President Vladimir Putin reportedly contacted the White House through multiple channels during the first week of February, utilizing both formal diplomatic communication and back-channel contacts to convey Moscow's opposition to American strikes on Iran. Intelligence reporting suggests Putin emphasized that Russian military commitments in Ukraine and Syria have created dependencies on Iranian support that would be jeopardized by a sustained American military campaign. The Russian leader reportedly warned that Moscow could not remain neutral if American operations threatened Russian personnel or assets in Iranian territory, raising the specter of direct Russian-American military confrontation. Putin reportedly proposed a framework where Russia would mediate between Washington and Tehran, offering to guarantee Iranian compliance with nuclear restrictions in exchange for American military restraint and sanctions relief that would benefit Russian energy exports. The coordination between Xi and Putin on this matter represents a significant convergence of interests between Beijing and Moscow, demonstrating that both powers view American military action against Iran as threatening to their strategic positions. For China, Iranian petroleum supplies are critical to economic stability, and any disruption would force greater reliance on alternative suppliers at higher cost. For Russia, Iranian military cooperation provides essential support for operations in Syria and offers strategic depth against Western pressure. Both nations calculate that allowing the United States to unilaterally reshape the Middle East through military force would establish precedents that could later be applied against Chinese or Russian interests in their respective regions. The intensity and specificity of the Xi-Putin intervention attempts suggest genuine alarm within both capitals about the trajectory of American policy. Intelligence assessments indicate that both leaders believed they possessed sufficient leverage, economic for China, military for Russia, to influence Trump's decision-making. The reported rejection of their appeals has forced both Beijing and Moscow to reassess their understanding of American calculations and to consider whether they possess meaningful constraints on Washington's freedom of action. This recalibration could drive both powers toward more assertive responses designed to impose costs on American unilateralism and demonstrate that ignoring great power concerns carries strategic penalties. President Trump's reported decision to reject the diplomatic interventions from Xi and Putin reflects several intersecting factors that appear to outweigh concerns about great power opposition. First, domestic political considerations play a significant role. Trump has consistently positioned himself as the leader who confronts Iran decisively, contrasting his approach with what he characterizes as Obama-era appeasement and Biden-era weakness. With midterm elections approaching in November 2026, demonstrating strength through military action against a long-standing adversary offers political benefits that could consolidate support among key constituencies. Polling data suggests significant public support for confronting Iran, particularly among voters concerned about nuclear proliferation and terrorism, providing Trump with domestic political cover for military operations despite international opposition. Second, Trump appears to calculate that neither China nor Russia will translate their diplomatic opposition into meaningful military or economic retaliation. Despite Putin's warnings about Russian interests in Iran, Moscow remains heavily engaged in Ukraine and lacks capacity for simultaneous confrontation with the United States in the Middle East. China possesses greater economic leverage, but appears reluctant to trigger trade conflicts that would damage its own economy given current domestic challenges, including deflation and manufacturing overcapacity. Trump's assessment likely concludes that both Beijing and Moscow will ultimately accept American military action as a fait accompli, rather than risk direct confrontation or economic disruption. Third, intelligence assessments suggest Trump believes the current moment offers a uniquely favorable window for Iran operations. Iranian air defenses remain degraded from June 2025 strikes. Reconstruction of nuclear facilities remains incomplete, and internal protests have weakened regime legitimacy. Delaying operations would allow Iran to rebuild capabilities and potentially reconstitute its nuclear program to levels where military strikes become less effective. From this perspective, acting now, despite international opposition, is preferable to waiting for conditions to deteriorate. The administration appears to calculate that swift, decisive military success would render diplomatic opposition moot, forcing international actors to accept new realities rather than attempting to reverse accomplished facts. Fourth, Trump's rejection of Xi and Putin's appeals sends strategic messages extending beyond the immediate Iran question. By demonstrating willingness to act unilaterally despite great power opposition, the administration signals that traditional diplomatic constraints no longer bind American decision-making. This approach aims to establish that the United States will pursue its interests regardless of international consensus, forcing adversaries to adjust their strategies around American primacy rather than assuming they can negotiate outcomes through coalition building. Whether this gambit succeeds depends on whether China and Russia conclude that opposing American unilateralism is futile, or whether they redouble efforts to build alternative power centers capable of constraining Washington. As the strike timeline apparently accelerates, all major parties are adjusting their strategic positions in anticipation of military operations. The United States has conducted extensive force deployments, including carrier strike groups, Air Force bomber wings, and specialized units equipped for operations against hardened targets. Intelligence reporting indicates ongoing evacuation of non-essential American personnel from regional bases, suggesting preparations for Iranian retaliation against U.S. facilities. The forward positioning of Patriot and THAAD missile defense systems indicates expectations of Iranian ballistic missile responses, similar to those launched during June 2025 operations. Iranian positioning reflects preparations for sustained conflict, extending beyond initial American strikes. Tehran has dispersed military assets to reduce vulnerability to precision strikes, relocated critical command personnel to hardened facilities, and mobilized proxy forces throughout the region. Intelligence assessments suggest Iran is preparing asymmetric responses, including attacks on commercial shipping, cyber operations against critical infrastructure, and activation of proxy forces to strike American and Israeli targets. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has reportedly placed ballistic missile units on heightened alert and pre-positioned munitions for rapid launch operations, designed to overwhelm regional missile defenses through saturation tactics. Chinese positioning appears focused on economic and diplomatic responses rather than military intervention. Beijing has accelerated efforts to stockpile Iranian petroleum in anticipation of supply disruptions, engaged in intensive diplomatic outreach to European and Asian partners to build opposition to American military action, and positioned itself as the reasonable alternative to American unilateralism. Intelligence reporting suggests China is preparing economic retaliation measures, including potential restrictions on critical mineral exports and reduced purchases of American agricultural products, calculating that economic leverage offers safer response mechanisms than military confrontation. Russian positioning remains more ambiguous, with Moscow conducting diplomatic protests while avoiding military commitments that could trigger direct confrontation with the United States. Putin appears to calculate that verbal opposition and economic cooperation with Iran demonstrate solidarity without accepting risks of military engagement against superior American forces. However, intelligence assessments suggest Russia is quietly reinforcing its positions in Syria and enhancing air defense capabilities around facilities where Russian personnel operate, indicating preparations to defend Russian interests if American operations expand beyond Iranian territory or threaten Russian assets. The confrontation over Iran strike plans represents a critical test of whether traditional great power concert mechanisms retain relevance in contemporary international politics. Historically, conflicts involving major power interests were negotiated through diplomatic frameworks where concerns were acknowledged and compromises crafted to prevent unilateral action. The apparent American decision to proceed despite explicit Chinese and Russian opposition suggests that this model no longer functions effectively, raising fundamental questions about international stability in an era where the dominant power rejects constraint. For the international system, Trump's rejection of Xi and Putin's appeals establishes precedents that could reshape great power interactions across multiple domains. If the United States demonstrates capacity to execute major military operations despite opposition from China and Russia without suffering significant consequences, it may encourage more frequent resort to unilateral force and discourage adversaries from believing that diplomatic intervention can modify American behavior. Conversely, if China and Russia successfully impose costs that force American recalculation, it could embolden challenges to American primacy across multiple regions and encourage coalition building designed to constrain Washington's freedom of action. The crisis also illuminates diverging approaches to international order among the major powers. The United States under Trump appears committed to a vision where American power operates with minimal constraint, forcing adversaries to accept outcomes through demonstration of superior capabilities. China and Russia prefer managed competition where major powers acknowledge each other's core interests and negotiate arrangements that avoid direct confrontation. The incompatibility of these visions creates structural instability where miscalculation risks escalate rapidly because parties operate according to fundamentally different assumptions about appropriate conduct. The leaked Iran strike plans and the failed Xi-Putin diplomatic intervention represent an inflection point where the international system's capacity to manage major power disagreements through established mechanisms appears exhausted. Trump's reported rejection of appeals from the leaders of China and Russia indicates either supreme confidence in American capabilities and adversary restraint, or profound miscalculation about the willingness of great powers to accept unilateral American military action in regions where they possess significant interests. The coming weeks will reveal whether Trump's gambit succeeds in establishing new terms for international relations, or whether it triggers responses that demonstrate the limits of American power and the resilience of great power balancing. What remains certain is that traditional assumptions about international stability no longer hold. When diplomatic intervention by the world's second and third most powerful states fails to influence American military decision-making, it suggests that the constraints that historically prevented great power conflicts have weakened to dangerous levels. Whether this leads to American dominance that adversaries grudgingly accept, or to sustained competition that escalates beyond anyone's control, will define the international environment for years to come. The Iran crisis may be resolved through swift American military success, extended conflict, or last-minute diplomacy, but the precedents established by Trump's willingness to defy Xi and Putin will shape great power relations long after the immediate crisis concludes.